the idea of the old versus young landscapes. I pointed out on Princess Royal Harbour, we had a shoreline there. It's dynamic, often disturbed is the term I use in the acronym for YODFLs, young, often disturbed, fertile landscapes, and it's dynamic on a daily basis for tides, and then seasonally with storms and the adjustment of the Lewin Current up and down the west coast, and then profoundly dynamic in terms of tens of years, centuries, thousands of years, to the point where 18,000 years ago it didn't exist. It would have been a freshwater lake 40 kilometres inland. And the plants we saw just driving along is just a continuous stream of the same native plants and a few weeds all the way around the shore. So it's all about a relatively simple plant community and animal community that are easily and rapidly dispersed and are used to being battered around by the elements and disturbed regularly and recolonised. That's how that system functions. Up here, and we're not far away at all, off the ocean. It's just a kilometre down below us, in fact, at King George Sound. But up here, if you just look at this zone, we're sitting on rock, and then you go into shallow soil. That's a bit of an erosional product, so disturbed a fair bit by storm damage and that sort of thing. But it's got just look at the succession of plants. You could start off with moss, and then all these little annual plants and perennials with tiny tubers colonising in there. So that, if you like, that's a mini yodful, like the shoreline I just described. Not very rich in species, but as the soil gets deeper, you start to notice perennial plants, and they get bigger as the soil gets deeper and deeper. And the plant families that are represented here are often different from those on the shoreline. So this is these things have had the duration of their lineages to evolve in these sort of environments. And so here in southwestern Australia, it's 4 families that are richest in species. It's the Myrtaceae, which is the resprouting shrub here as an example. That's a taxandria, related to the eucalypts and that sort of thing. Fabaceae, and I don't know if you notice the little red-flowered prostrate thing. It's a red conidia, and it's red because it's bird-pollinated. That's an important story in itself to do with octopus. Ericaceae, which is the heath family, and there's some of them a bit further over, not right here that I can see. And the other big family is Proteaceae, so that's the Banksias and Grevilleas. And we have just here granite Banksia, Banksia verticillata, which is endemic to these coastal hills from Walpole to Mount Many Peaks, just in the Albany area, and is succumbing to an aerial-borne canker and a change in the fire regime here. It takes about 15 to 20 years for this thing to grow up big enough to start flowering and producing seed. So recurrent fire is a threat to it. And it's probably the only example I can give you of a thing that is blipping out of this landscape in local populations because of the combination of disease and fire regime now prevalent. But they're the 4 big families up here. And the granite Banksia is an example, and that's got a world geographical range of just about 100 kilometres along the south coast. And that's it, known from 20 different major granite outcrop systems. It's on this granite outcrop, but it's not on some of the granite outcrops on the far slope, but it is on that hill bumping up just in front of Mount Melville with the tower on top, for example. So it's dotted on these granite outcrops, but not on every one. And if you like, this is like a classic island archipelago of granite in a sea of vegetation in deeper soils. And it behaves just as Darwin inferred evolution goes on in the Galapagos. You get the isolation created by the island and limited seed dispersal. The only thing that'll push the follicles of this Banksia from this hill to the next hill is either an updraft in a wildfire, which is very rare, or black cockatoos. They feed on the seed and they'll fly that distance easily just on a daily basis to go to their roost over the hill.
And these granite islands have a much deeper place in deep time as well, don't they?
They do indeed. So the rock here is essentially timeless. It's 1.2 billion years old, and the stub of a granite mountain range that's been around for that long, a quarter of the age of the Earth itself. So much older than the angiosperms, the flowering plants, for example. Proteaceae, 100 million years, maybe 120 million years back to their ancestor. Effectively this has been a series of terrestrial islands for the duration of the whole family of Proteaceae. And that's slowly speciated in landscapes like this. And one of the big things we're finding out with hawkbills, with these old climatically buffered infertile landscapes, is it's not necessarily accentuated speciation rates that characterise them, it's accentuated persistence, a lack of extinction rather than regular extinction. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about it. If the essential elements of the habitat have been here forever, as Aboriginal people will tell you, then plants that crack how to live on infertile, shallow soils on granite have got a lifetime in perpetuity for tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years. So that's the feature of this. The plants are telling you that you're really in old, ancient habitats. Not to say change hasn't occurred, but it's been slower, and because of the combination of the climatic buffering by the oceans for tens of millions of years, no glacier has come and swept across this landscape and reset the clock. The sea has never been up on top of these hills. Even 90 million years ago, at the highest sea level recorded for Earth, I think it was about 250 metres above present datum. We're higher than 200 metres above sea level here, so you would have had the ocean lapping a bit closer, but these things would have been, or their ancestors would have been here persisting. How profoundly different is that to what you see down on the shorelines, around the lakes, along the rivers, the young parts of the landscape. And I think as soon as you start to perceive country like that, not only is it closer to an Aboriginal understanding, the Burungurup, the home of the totem spirits, the place you revere, you don't touch, you don't mess with, you behave respectfully towards. That's exactly the right conservation biological approach to these places. Don't mess with them. Don't play around with them. Don't think that, climate change is coming, so we better move this banksia from this hill to the next hill. It's been able to cope with those sort of challenges for much longer than our species has been around, let alone they've been around. So that's the story that this country tells you, that Aboriginal people have lived by as well. And the place to mess around with things and do things is what most people will tell you is fragile and shouldn't be messed with, and that is wetlands and coastlines and that. But as long as you leave space for biodiversity in amongst the things we do when we mess around, they're much more tolerant of disturbance, human disturbance, natural disturbance. And if you want to be a restoration ecologist, work on coastal areas, work on wetlands, because you'll get the easy wins. You're dealing with a biota, with plants and animals that are used to disturbance. You'll have some major problems like weeds and disease to deal with, pollution, but compared to the introduction of weeds or disease or pollution to an old ancient place like this, the consequences are orders of magnitude different. And that's a complete converse of what you learn as a conservation biologist. What farmers might say in this landscape. The farmers are after the fertile bits, of course, and the old hill out the paddock, the old laterite hill, the high sand plain, leave alone. Maybe, it's pretty worthless, pretty useless. I think Charles Darwin summarised it when he first sailed into Sydney Harbour by saying, the landscape is of sandstone in layers and useless vegetation. when he came here in Albany, he was in King George Sound for 10 days, working as a geologist mostly. But he wrote, "I've never been in such a dull and uninteresting place and never wished to revisit the shores again." And then he went to the Cocos Islands and across to Cape Town, which has got the richest flora of any city on the planet, and wrote equally disparaging remarks about nothing interesting to see. I went on a trip out to Paarl, which was about 50 kilometres to the east of Cape Town, and saw all this useless scrub and sterile country. And he was just reflecting the fundamentally broad Northern Hemisphere European experience of young landscapes, young, often disturbed, fertile landscapes, where most people live, where most biologists grow up, where Darwin himself learned his trade, and where he spent most of the time on the Beagle expedition in South America, looking at uplifted mountains, uplifted coral reefs. So he was adopting Lyell's principle of geology, that what you can see in small changes today in these young, often disturbed landscapes is what must have gone on in the past. Eminently sensible. And he came to Sydney and got it profoundly wrong. He thought the Blue Mountains were an uplifted oceanic coastline. We now know that it's an ancient 300 million, 400 million year old landscape that's been weathered into the form you see it today by rainfall. And he came to Albany and was on this very landscape we're sitting here, and interpreted this peninsula and these hills as recently uplifted from the sea. And we now know that where we are right now has never been below sea level. So you have to start thinking as a Southern Hemisphere biologist about these places. Many of these places may well have existed in the Northern Hemisphere, but 20,000 years ago, the glaciation, the massive glaciation of Eurasia and North America, just wiped out almost all of the record. There are little places called Nunatak in post-glacial landscapes in the Northern Hemisphere that are exceptionally rich in endemic plants, and they're probably little legacies of these sort of places we're sitting now in the Northern Hemisphere. But just that difference in landscape history has profoundly influenced geological science, biological science. And a student like me who was brought up on the European literature in Perth at UWA, in general biology, and all the books were written by people from pretty much all the books, Northern Hemisphere, and they write about places they know, which are these young, often disturbed, fertile places in the main, and they come to places like this just as Darwin did, and there's complete incomprehension. They can't interpret it. Worthless, useless, sterile, rocky. Not much good for any enterprising Western technological economic rationalist. So a lot of them, fortunately, have ended up in national parks, and we can be forever thankful for that, because that's because of the limited funding that national park managers get. They leave places like this by and large alone, and that's exactly what you should do.